Darren Bailey is back in the race for governor. We'll talk about that and more on the latest episode of Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to Capital Cast. I'm Jerry Nowicki, filling in this week for Peter Hancock, who's got the week off. I'm talking to Ben Szalinski, who's been busy this week. He had an interview with Senator Dick Durbin. He covered Darren Bailey's announcement for his second run at governor, and he wrote several other stories this week, which we will discuss today. So, Ben, you were in Bloomington for the second leg of Bailey's three-stop helicopter tour of the state to kick off his campaign. The former state senator is making another run after losing to Pritzker by about 13 points last cycle. So, famously or infamously, he referred to Chicago as a hellhole last time around. What has he assured you is going to be different about this campaign?
Yeah, this time around, I don't think Darren Bailey's going to call Chicago a hellhole. He's making a pretty clear effort, at least right out of the gate here, to reach out to Chicago voters. He wants to focus more on those suburban voters that he did not get in the 2022 election. He did very, very well in the primary, but he only received 24% of the vote in the general election in Cook County. And there's kind of been this unofficial rule in Illinois politics that you need to win at least like 30% of the vote or something like that in Cook County in order to be successful. So, um, I think what we're really going to see from Darren this time around is a more broad focus on the state of Illinois. He's not going to talk as much about maybe his background in farming and his downstate roots. He's going to talk more about the problems he believes that people throughout Illinois face more broadly, which are issues of high taxes, some of the economic struggles that we've heard. It really sounds like he's going to make economics a big issue of this campaign, which is probably the right direction for a Republican candidate to go. So probably a little less public safety and a little less Chicago bashing is going to be his strategy this year to potentially win over more suburban voters.
And in that regard, is he kind of going to be running against his past self? Is he going to be able to put the hellhole comments? And because it wasn't just one off. I mean, he kind of disparaged the city, even though I mean, to his credit, he did live there for a bit during the campaign. But is he running against his previous self?
Yeah, in some ways, it feels like he kind of is. I mean, he acknowledged yesterday that he made mistakes in his first campaign. He didn't really get specific about what those mistakes were, but I imagine, remarks like this are kind of what he's thinking about. He didn't focus as much on winning over voters in the city and the suburbs. He was always bashing the city, and that's not really popular even with suburban voters. So. I think he's kind of trying to be open about acknowledging that, I didn't do things, the best way to win a statewide campaign last time around. So, you know, in some ways, I think he's trying to also tell voters that he is a different candidate, that he does view the state differently. He picked, Cook County Republican Chair Aaron Del Mar to be his running mate very specifically so he can have a Republican voice from the suburbs helping to run this campaign. So I think Bailey is kind of, acknowledging that, the past is probably not the best way to run a campaign. And, this time around, he thinks it'll be different. He's going to have a different message for those voters.
Now we got a long way to go, but it seems like at least he's moderating himself, a little bit of a moderation message type, wanting to be more of a moderate candidate. But I mean, even his recent track record, it's not like he went away in 2022. He ran in 2024, trying to make himself the more conservative candidate than a very conservative member of Congress, Mike Bost, in Southern Illinois. I guess is it even a more drastic pivot from 2024 than it is from 2022?
Yeah, that's where I think the biggest difference probably is because, he sought Donald Trump's endorsement in that 2024 race and didn't get it. And he did get that endorsement in 2022. So, he tried running to the right of Mike Bost, which is kind of hard to do. Mike Bost is a very conservative guy. He's not apologetic about it either. And, Bailey, for whatever various reasons he mentioned on the campaign trail, thought Mike Bost just wasn't conservative enough. So, in a statewide primary here, part of the trick is winning over your base, which means you do have to, in some ways, out conservative your other opponents. But I think the difference in this election for Darren Bailey is he's already the most well-known person in the race. He does not need to introduce himself to the Republican voters, so he can more just kind of, I think, be himself. He doesn't really need to carve out some lane in conservatism or, position himself as maybe more to the right of somebody else. Voters already know who he is, so he can kind of just run on his own track record and his own background where, you know, voters will just make the decision for themselves if he is the right Republican candidate, kind of regardless of conservative credentials.
Right. So we're kind of a long way from 2018, 19, 20 when he was in the state legislature, but fill us in a little bit about how Darren Bailey sort of became a household name in Illinois.
Yeah, Darren Bailey, very early in the pandemic, began challenging stay-at-home orders, mask mandates in Clay County Court, where, he got some favorable rulings from judges that ultimately did not hold up statewide. But these lawsuits that he filed made him really kind of the poster for people who were opposed to these COVID mitigations. A lot of, Republican and conservative people thought it was executive overreach by the Democrat governor J.B. Pritzker, and Darren Bailey became the face for those conservatives in Illinois who allowed them in rural communities that weren't initially very affected by COVID. And those people didn't want to be staying at home. They didn't want to have to wear masks because COVID wasn't that prevalent in their communities at that time. And he really capitalized on a lot of anger that people felt because it was, a pretty dark time in world history, and people were frustrated by everything that was going on. And Darren Bailey became their hero by directly standing up to J.B. Pritzker when really no one else in Illinois was pushing back at the time.
And Bailey's lawyer in that case was Thomas DeVore. And DeVore himself sort of capitalized on his willingness to sue the state. He had several clients he was signing up to be part of these orders blocking COVID restrictions. I should also note he became the Republican Attorney General candidate in the last cycle as well, 2022, and he lost by about 11 points to Kwame Raoul. But I will note DeVore was in the news this week too, but not in a good way. He'll have his license suspended for 60 days in response to inappropriate sexual relationship he had with a client amid the flurry of COVID-19 lawsuits. So the Supreme Court authorized that suspension of his license late last week. And if you want to know more about that, you can read Hannah Meisel's story at capitalnewsillinois.com. But Ben, I wanted to talk to you about the man who defeated DeVore in 2022, Attorney General Kwame Raoul. He had some good news to share this week, at least as far as state coffers are concerned. Tell us about the most recent legal victory against the Trump administration.
Yeah, this is going back to one of Donald Trump's earliest executive orders that he filed, I think, on the ninth day of his presidency, actually, at the beginning of the year. And the president's executive order basically required the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies under its command, more specifically in this case, FEMA, to stop providing federal emergency funding to states that don't follow Donald Trump's preferred immigration policies. So, Illinois, as everyone is well aware, is a sanctuary state where state law enforcement are prohibited by state law from participating in civil immigration enforcement within the state of Illinois. And obviously, that is a policy that Donald Trump directly opposes. So he signed an executive order to try and compel states to follow, federal immigration law to try and carry out, I guess, create an incentive in some ways, more with the stick rather than the carrot, to follow along with his preferred immigration policies. But the state of Illinois, many other Democrat-led states filed a lawsuit challenging this because Congress is the only one who can decide if funding gets retracted or additional funding gets expanded. And the president can't do that through executive order, or federal agencies can't just withhold that funding arbitrarily. And a federal judge in Rhode Island that was part of the lawsuit ruled in favor of Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul and other Democratic attorneys general, um, basically finding that, yeah, Congress is the only one who can make any changes to money that's already been appropriated. And it's really a significant victory for the state because the state received more than $800 million in 2024 for emergency funding. That's, natural disasters, disaster preparedness, training that the state emergency management agency goes through every year. So um, Kwame Raoul's victory really did save the state a pretty significant amount of money, and money that a lot of people really depend on after natural disasters in the state.
And I should note here, whenever we talk about the Trust Act, it's important to note that the state can absolutely participate in arrest on criminal charges for any, regardless of immigration status, and they can work with ICE if there's a federal judicial warrant for, criminal activity or something like that. It's just the civil immigration matters that specifically related to immigration status that is prohibited here. Obviously, immigration is a major issue in Illinois and across the country. We've seen protesters pepper sprayed and manhandled by ICE agents in Broadview. I think I saw some reporting that even Broadview police were caught in the pepper spray at one point. Um, and in Texas, obviously, a tragic situation. Two detainees were shot by an apparent, anarchist, terrorist who said his intent was to terrorize ICE agents, or said in a note before taking his own life. Now, through all of this, one major complaint from state and local officials is they've received little or no information from the federal government about ICE enforcement in Chicago, the Chicago area. Senator Durbin, U.S. Senator Durbin, was in Springfield this week, and Ben, you were able to catch him for a few questions. What did he tell you about ICE, Homeland Security? What does he know, if anything?
Yeah, he doesn't know anything that the rest of us don't already know. These Democrat lawmakers are learning about everything the same way we are through news reports. But Senator Durbin did tell me that he was hopeful that he would be able to have a meeting with ICE leadership at some point here in the next week to talk about what is the federal government trying to do here in the Chicago area. All we've really seen is that ICE and the Border Patrol have come into the Chicago area, and they've made a lot of, in some cases, pretty brazen arrests just of people on the street. We don't really know exactly what their long-term plans are, how long they're planning to be here, how many people they've even arrested so far. Senator Durbin told me that he's got some pretty basic questions for ICE, like what do you do with people after you arrest them? Because that's been a pretty open-ended question. So he's hoping that there's going to be a meeting with himself and other Democrat members of Congress from Illinois to get what he said is a routine briefing that other presidential administrations have previously provided to members of Congress for various things that executive branch agencies are doing. And that's obviously not happening under Trump's second administration here. So Senator Durbin's hoping to get some answers out of this. He and other members of Congress sent a letter to ICE earlier in the week that basically sent them a long list of questions similar to kind of what I mentioned, just asking for basic information about what is going on here in the Chicago area. But we'll see if Senator Durbin and others actually get that meeting. Obviously, this has continued to be an escalating thing. I mean, the Border Patrol is sailing their boats down the Chicago River now. There's more skirmishes at the Broadview facility today on Friday. So certainly remains to be seen if any answers are going to be given to anyone, let alone the one of the highest ranking U.S. senators.
Well, and I think there was another point in your article, your interview with Senator Durbin that he made, and there's a supposition, or at least it's been said by many people who are supportive of this movement, ICE crackdown, is that it's only targeting criminals. We've seen a lot of reporting about it just simply being people who have no criminal records who are being targeted in these. I mean, we've even seen U.S. Citizens temporarily held. But I mean, what did Durbin have to say about that supposition that it's only targeting criminals?
Yeah, he pointed out basically what you just mentioned there, that it's kind of indiscriminate who ICE is targeting here in these actions in the Chicago area. Also the mantra that we've constantly heard from the Trump administration is they're targeting the worst murderers, rapists, terrible people, terrorists. And that's what these immigration raids are designed to get at, is getting these people out of the country. And we've certainly seen a lot of people who have absolutely no criminal record who've been arrested in many of these cases. Uh, there's lots of various reporting on this, but some of the more recent reporting from my colleagues at NBC Chicago have found that about 7 out of 10 people who've been arrested by ICE have no criminal background. So Senator Durbin's very concerned about that. That was one of the big questions he has for ICE, and that, you know, you say you're trying to go after these people, but that's clearly not true when people who've been in this country for many decades are being picked up despite having no sort of criminal record, maybe beyond a traffic ticket.
Yeah, just today, there's recent video coming out of New York where there's a child and a wife being ripped from a husband's arms, thrown to the ground, hair pulled. And this is just on the site of immigration court where these people are supposed to be going through the proceedings as to whether they can legally stay in the country or not. And then ICE is just interceding and just taking them away. So we will continue to follow up next week with Senator Durbin, see if he gets that meeting and see where we go from here. So obviously there is other tensions between the Pritzker administration and the Trump administration. We see them every single day. So it came up in a couple of other stories we covered this week. Illinois will recommend all adults receive the COVID-19 vaccine this fall, bucking the recent Trump administration guidance. And then, Ben, another story you write, Pritzker issued an executive order directing agencies to lower spending by about 4% or identify about 4% in reserves. And he largely blamed that on the uncertainty that he says is the result of Trump administration policies, the big, beautiful Bill Act, as Trump has dubbed it, and tariffs and whatever else. Then it was kind of interesting that he did that, chose to do that via executive order. In previous years, he's just sent a memo saying, we need to identify these cuts. But what does that executive order do, and why do you think it focused so heavily on Trump?
Yeah, I think on the Trump question, it's really the governor trying to cast some blame. Part of his ongoing war with Donald Trump over literally every issue, it seems, basically these days. But I think it's important to note, though, on Illinois was facing some budget challenges before Donald Trump was even elected. There was a report that came out from the governor's office before the presidential election last year that showed the state was facing upwards of like a $3 billion deficit that lawmakers were going to have to make up. I think it's worth noting that, there was already signs in the economy of, a slowing pace of revenue that was coming in completely independent of Donald Trump's election. Obviously, we have seen policies from the president from Washington now that have certainly also changed the economy, whether it's tariffs or new changes to tax policy that are potentially going to reduce some revenue that are coming into the state. So that's just a piece of the issue, but some of these challenges certainly go back before the president. But really, what the governor is trying to get at here in this executive order is that there are much more clear signs now that the economy is slowing down. Job growth is certainly down much lower nationally and in the state of Illinois in the recent months. And there's other just signs that revenue is certainly slowing down. There's federal changes that have been made that are going to cause state budgets to have to increase because states are asked to cover more for various programs, while also potentially receiving less revenue via federal avenues. So that's one part of the equation, but also economic situations that are potentially going to cause revenue to really not grow as much this year as state lawmakers may have liked. So this 4%, I guess withholding that the governor is asking through this executive order, it's not really a spending cut. It's more just asking state agencies to reserve 4% of their funds. Uh, Really seems to be getting at that there's probably going to be no revenue growth. If you took 4% across the entire state budget, that's a little more than $2 billion, which is about the size of spending growth in this year's budget compared to last year. So, I think that's kind of what the governor is getting at here, in that there's a lot of headwinds the state is facing on revenue, and we're only in the second month of the fiscal year. or at least we only have revenue numbers through the first 2 months of the fiscal year. So these challenges are coming early, and I think it's also just a signal to lawmakers that, hey, you might want to take a look at this, and you should certainly be aware of this going into veto session and well aware of this by the time we get into the spring session in January.
All right. So that's kind of what we were working on this week. Kind of a busy week, down a man in the State House Bureau. So, Ben, great job covering all the news. For our listeners, I'll direct you to a story we're going to have Monday. It'll be about um, our friends at the Medill, Illinois News Bureau have surveyed 28 sheriffs. They tried to survey all 102, but they only got about a quarter of them about how they're enforcing the Trust Act regarding immigration and whether they'd work with ICE. So it'll be a pretty extensive review there. I'll point you to our website on Monday. But that's going to do it for this week's episode of Capital Cast, a regular podcast of Capital News, Illinois. Peter Hancock will be back next week for our regular programming. Until then, thank you for listening.